So one thing that I thought about when I was watching the most recent Democratic debate was that, besides Bernie Sanders' incredible hand gestures, was just how the staying power of criminal justice as an issue in the race. I mean, it was almost 2 years ago, Eric Garner happened, around the same time Michael Brown, but it's still it's not, if not the top question, it's one of the leading questions that at least the Democratic side has focused on, which I think, given how fickle American politics usually is, I think that's kind of interesting.
I think it is really interesting, but I also think that basically Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton are trying to make their case and explain their differences in criminal justice policy. But now that Rand Paul's been out of the race on the Republican side, the subject has largely been sort of left out of the discussion. And so I do really wonder, when we pivot to the general election, what's going to happen and where criminal justice is going to fall, and whether we're just going to go back to the same sort of tough on crime from the right, we need reform on the left, and whether that sort of agreement that seemed to be there will fall away, or whether it will actually continue.
Right, because so much of the Democratic race has been cast anyway as a fight for African American voters, for whom that's a big issue, and right, that dynamic may well change when we get to the general. Have any of the Republicans said anything about this? I'm trying to think.
I think, well, many of them have in
besides Rand Paul.
In recent years, I think if you go back, I think there was somebody published like a book of essays that various possible candidates wrote in back in like 2014, 2015, where like Rubio and Cruz discussed some like criminal justice issues. But I think the reason it's been so persistent is because it's politically expedient, because the public safety is no longer the number one concern for many more Americans than it was 20, 30 years ago. So people are no longer kind of blinded by fear and can now kind of look at the consequences of the policies from the tough on crime era. So I think this kind of ambiguous term, criminal justice reform, is sort of just the backlash of us kind of recognizing the negative consequences of the previous era without being blinded by the fear of kind of what the crime rates were back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder too if part of it, I mean, one thing Sanders talks about is, the sheer number of people who are, involved in the system. And obviously if you were to tally up cumulatively over the years, it'd be millions and millions of people. I wonder if like enough people now have either been busted or jailed or imprisoned themselves, or know someone who has, that like everyone is sort of touched by it in some way. Because crime's not as big a concern, but the flip side, why is there suddenly this sympathy for people who were considered super predators 20 years ago by Hillary anyway?
I think it's really interesting on the conservative side that a lot of it actually hasn't been driven so much by sympathy, but more of a fiscal responsibility to lower costs. So you don't always see from the conservative side that you're feeling bad for people, really, that it's more like this is just a huge waste of taxpayer dollars. At the same time, on the right, there is a sort of break off of the religious part of the party that feels that this is actually like a human rights crisis. But those two things don't always get put together, in my opinion, when I watch the right. On the left, that's often the discussion is just, that there's too many people involved, there's too many people that don't need to be involved in the criminal justice system. But yeah, once again, the bipartisanship that seemed to be coalescing now, when we see the sentencing reform bill and other things kind of dying, you just kind of wonder, does the momentum keep up? And then when you have someone like Trump and Cruz ahead, there's no sympathetic criminal justice elements coming out. This is who can be tougher, really. So it's sort of just harkening back to the 90s, when it was all about, are you soft on crime, and that being like just a political death if people.
Right, a scarlet letter. Yeah.
Maybe I'm naive. I feel like I'm optimistic though.
That's good.
And I think the reason, and I think part of the reason, I think like at this very moment today, the discourse is being driven by presidential election politics. Mm-hmm. But I think the trajectory is moving forward, and I think the reason is that, like you suggested earlier, criminal justice reform does kind of play into the angels of both conservatives and liberals. For conservatives, the criminal justice system right now is a big government, expensive program that has a lot of like fat that can be trimmed. And for liberals, it's a civil rights issue, and it plays into like the bleeding heart aspects of getting justice for the disenfranchised. And I think once kind of the mess of the campaign season is over, I think it'll pick back up. I think a lot of the current, the Ferguson effect myths and all that, I think over time that will kind of die down as the trends kind of balance back out to what they have been for the past couple of decades. And I think it'll pick up. I think it'll pick up within the next couple of years.
Let's talk about that. We're going to get to governing at some point, right? And so let's say, I mean, the Democratic debates have talked more about this, you're right, than Republicans, but some of the answers have been pretty vague. I will reform this, honest, it's a terrible thing. But when you guys dial it down, like, what do you think Hillary and Bernie, because we're on a first-name basis with them, what are they actually proposing? What do they seek to do? I mean, Bernie talks about reducing the prison population, but are there specifics there?
I think what's so tough and what really speaks to what you just said is that really the reform has to happen at a more local level. I mean, the vast majority of people who are incarcerated are in state prisons, so whatever a president thinks, they can't do anything about that. I think Bernie's interesting because it's largely an issue he's never really had to deal with. He's a senator from Vermont, largely white, and not so much dealing with the larger incarceration crisis that some other states are. Not that they don't have one, but it's not something that it was a huge issue for him. So he's kind of becoming smarter about it, but he doesn't have a legacy that we can really look at. Hillary, on the other hand, has quite a long one, and she's been on all sides of the issue. So it's difficult, I think, to parse out really where she'll fall if she actually became president, because when you look over her career, she's really occupied so many different opinions, which makes sense because we've gone through such a scope of different opinions over time, but depending on what the crime rate was. It is interesting to see her and what she's saying now, and a lot of it might be following what Bernie's been saying. I mean, in so many ways, we all wonder what would be the debates, what would be the context of the discussion if Bernie hadn't kind of pushed so many things out into the forefront in terms of he's called for the banning of private prisons, and he often brings it up, and I think that's driven a lot of her bringing it up too.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point because the policy proposals in criminal justice very much reflect their policy proposals wider in the sense that kind of while Clinton's is more focused on, like, she has very specific proposals, like we're going to put $2 billion into this proposal, we're going to do this to mandatory minimums, we're going to have specific training protocols for local police departments. Bernie Sanders' rhetoric has been more like, we need to change the culture of police departments, we need to change the culture of how we view mass incarceration, we need to end racial profiling. But when it comes to the actual, like, here, the specific policy we're proposing, very similar. I think it's like when Obama and Clinton were facing off in 2008, where everyone was like, well, 95% of their policies are the same. I think criminal justice-wise, other than maybe gun control,
right,
they're very, very, like, similar on what they're proposing. And I think you're right. Sanders has definitely pushed, like, Clinton to the left and forced her to I think she kind of saw this opening where it's like, he's very to the left on economic policies, but he has not addressed criminal justice policies as vociferously, because to him it all stems from economics, and she's kind of been like, okay, well, let me kind of own this. And I think she came out with her criminal justice policy proposals, at least the specifics of it, like before he did, I think, because she saw that opening.
Right. I mean, I think the conversation recently about the '94 crime bill has been interesting because this goes to the whole federal versus local issue. I mean, that bill really only affected federal policy, but it's seen as kind of this watershed moment for enshrining, tough on crime measures. And I think there are state measures that obviously followed that. 3 strikes are out in California and elsewhere, but the feds do set the tone for this, right? So that there's a bully pulpit power the president would have.
It's true, well, because they can incentivize policy, because like the '94 crime bill incentivized treating youth as adults, it incentivized mandatory minimums, all for the states. So it drove policy, right? It didn't make it, but the states jump on, and so that can be very, influential.
So there's been a fair amount of absurd stuff said in the campaign, obviously. And one thing that bothered me in the last debate was talking about the '94 crime bill, that Hillary said that crime was soaring at that time, and actually it had already begun decreasing for like 4 years in a row, and that's the conversation in New York City often revolves around the same canard. But you guys have been paying attention to this more so than I. What sort of absurdities have you heard uttered by candidates or pundits on the crime issue?
I got a couple examples. Hold on, I got them on my phone. I can pull them up.
Great.
They're not presidential candidates, but they, I think,
someday they could be, right?
Someday they could be. This is the most absurd thing I've probably read in a while on criminal justice. It was a story in The Intercept about a private prison executive. I think they got some documents or some tape of a private prison executive talking to investors, like a frank conversation between a private prison company exec and his
I love those.
investors. Yeah. I don't know the guy's first name because I just have a screenshot, but his last name was March. I'll just read the paragraph. March argued that crime is inherent in America because of affluence. Quote, "No one is committing a lot of crimes in poor countries because, well, who are you going to steal from?"
Right.
He also claimed that mandatory minimum sentences have not greatly impacted the overall incarceration rates and that growth in mandatory sentencing has been, quote, "just as substantial as non-mandatory sentencing. Rather, quote, there's just been a lot more crime," which is patently untrue.
Right.
Like incarceration rates have gone up while crime has gone down, and yet here's this private prison executive claiming to his investors that no, actually crime's been going up. We don't need to worry about fixing these policies because it's not about these policies.
Right.
It's about crime.
That gets the gold star for absurdity. Did you see anything?
I mean, there's one thing that keeps standing out to me, and it does come up in the presidential debates, and it's just kind of mentioned by anyone, which is that we have this really big problem of incarcerating nonviolent drug offenders, which I wouldn't argue is not the case, but nonviolent drug offenders make up a really small portion of the people that are incarcerated.
It's like 15%.
Yeah, so
right?
in state prisons, there's 1.3 million people incarcerated, and 16% of them are there for some kind of nonviolent drug crime. That's so important, I think, to point out, because if we really want to think about incarceration and how to reduce it, I think the conversation has to expand, no matter how politically difficult it is, to people who maybe are in there for violent crimes or for theft or fraud, because those are the kinds of things people kind of agree people need to be in jail for, but they're sort of the third rail. It's just not really discussed, and all you ever hear is about nonviolent drug offenders. And for me, I just find that to be really simplistic, and it's just easy, because at that point that does have compassion from people, and that's good. But that's not actually what's driving the larger issues with mass incarceration. I mean, it's a part of it, but I think if you ask the general public, because it gets repeated so often, it seems like that's our main problem. Like, we have all these people in jail because they were found with a joint. That's just not the case.
Right.
That's such a good point, because it's so easy to say, like, oh, well, these nonviolent drug offenders, and that's like become the peg word.
It is, yeah.
And like the reality is that, I think you've hit on the heart of why there is a ceiling to this current push for criminal justice reform. Because if we really want to address the incarceration rates, it's not about the nonviolent drug offenders, it's about the violent offenders, right?
That's
the great majority.
Especially now, because as the populations have come down in New York and nationally, what you're left with now.
That's more and more what you have.
Are those offenders.
So then I think the challenge becomes, and here's why full reform may never happen, is because the next conversation we have is going to be about sentencing length. And it's a lot harder, and I think Ta-Nehisi Coates made this point in the mass incarceration story in The Atlantic. It's a lot easier to extend sentences than it is to reel them back. Because then that means having a conversation about, well, should this armed robber do 8 years instead of like 18 years? And it's a lot harder to argue that, okay, this person who got drunk and ran somebody over and got voluntary manslaughter should only be in prison for 10 years instead of 20. I mean, it's a hard conversation to have.
Right.
But
it's interesting, because to some degree the reform movement has set up that problem.
Yeah.
Because take the death penalty, for example. Death penalty is wrong, so we want to get away from that. We'll give the person life without parole.
Right.
Great. Oh wait, now we just put someone in prison forever without any chance to actually rehabilitate, to prove they redeem themselves.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know, I wonder if that will move incrementally, or if you said that that's going to be kind of a hard stop to the reform movement, because in the end, it's like, if you kill someone, how long do you stay? Is 25 years better than 20?
And there's been zero discussion so far of sentencing length for violent crimes, right?
Yeah.
We've discussed sentencing length for drug crimes and for like a series of nonviolent crimes.
Right.
And we've discussed like making it easier for people to get on parole, making it easier for like people to get off on good behavior, but there's been no discussion on actually like adjusting the sentencing schedules, not like the minimums, but even like the maximums. It's just like
Yeah.
what is our new like moral standard going to be for how long somebody should be punished for whatever crime?
It's going to be tough because I think in America, culturally, we really like punishment. I feel like it's part of the culture here. And when you look somewhere like Germany, the average sentence for murder is 10 years. It's
Right.
really difficult to imagine that that would ever fly here, that that would be okay here. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but they have better outcomes than we have. And people come out and have way lower recidivism rates. And it's just, this is the topic that no one wants to discuss, because when it comes down to it, that's the kind of thing that could lose you an election.
Right.
You talk about somebody that's violent in a sympathetic way, like, all right, maybe 25 years is enough, guys. You're going to turn off a huge amount of people who don't think it's enough time and thinks you should just rot and the key should be thrown away, and that should be your outcome.
So let's talk about race and criminal justice, because that's how, as you said, that's how it's been framed in the Democratic debate. And obviously there is a significant overlap, but is race the only thing that people should be talking about when it comes to criminal justice? Because it's a huge system. There are a lot of white people involved. Is there a danger in talking too much about race, because then it becomes associated only with the question of racial justice, or is that appropriate, do you think?
I think the criminal justice system is one of many institutions in America that have been used to like oppress brown folks over the years. And so it's not like unique, right? Housing, education, local, state, federal legislatures. I guess you could argue the what makes this particular system unique and perhaps more dangerous is the fact of how it can like instantly destroy many lives over the course of generations. Like one arrest can lead to a domino effect of generations of turmoil. So I think race is it's important to recognize the role race plays in the criminal justice system, but I think the danger in conflating race and criminal justice too much is that it's the same argument that folks make against like Bernie Sanders and conflating economics and race too much.
Right.
Is that you start to forget that a lot of these issues are just racial issues, and that we can fix all the perceived problems we see within the criminal justice system and not address kind of the root issues of like racism in America. That like the criminal justice system will be a racist system as long as racism exists.
That's exactly what I was going to
In
say.
America,
Yeah.
Right. And also in terms of like the politics of it, if you suggest that it is only an issue that affects people of color, then there are millions of voters who will think it doesn't affect them or their families, but in fact it does, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who are part of the system. I mean, some of them are corrections officers and some of them are behind bars, but you know, there is that too. I mean, I guess it goes to the hubbub over the Bernie quote from the debate recently. Not all black people live in ghettos, and some white people are poor, and it's not a strict dichotomy.
And as we've seen with like the current stuff like stuff on heroin, is that it can be once a lot of white people realize how big an issue this is in like the white community, then suddenly, oh shit, heroin, we gotta deal with that problem now.
Right.
Yeah,
well, like Maine is like one of the whitest states in America, and they have a huge meth and heroin problem there.
Yeah, I think that's been such an interesting thing to watch and been so important, because while it's such a tragedy, it's also brought a lot of people into the justice system that may have never imagined that their families or their communities would have such a problem. And so I do wonder how much of a humanizing effect it has in terms of humanizing people who are behind bars, that for to see that maybe this could happen to people I know, and it's not just those people that they have their own problem and it's not my problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, locally, the conversation has been fascinating because there's obviously been the talk about policing in New York. There's also been the talk about how jails are run, Rikers Island and other local jails, and the question of how the justice system deals with pretrial detainees in terms of bail. Does the local conversation parallel the national one, do you think, or is it different somehow?
No, I think it does parallel the national one. I mean, what's different is we're talking about an urban environment. So if we're talking about like urban jails, we have all the same problems that big urban jails have. You know, it's like de facto mental illness institution, basically. I think when it comes to bail, it's very interesting because you're seeing a lot of bail reform efforts across the country. But a lot of times it's, in New York, for example, it's been portrayed a little bit disingenuously. Some of it arose after the suicide of Khalif Browder. There was sort of this call that we needed to reform bail, and his name was often invoked, but the actual reform that was put forward wouldn't have helped him because it was only for nonviolent charges, and he was charged with something, he was charged with a felony assault. So I see a lot of, and also the bail reform that was proposed in New York City would have helped about an extra 2,000 people a year, which, as we know, in New York City just isn't that many people. So it's, in the closing of Rikers is a very interesting issue because it also brings up things I think that happen all over the country, which is this, it brings this not in my backyard thought pattern to the forefront, which exists in most communities. It's just we like to think it doesn't. Nobody wants a jail. It's going to have huge opposition when jails are built in the city, which they'd have to be if Rikers were to close. And so I just don't know how you get around that. And Rikers is, that issue of closing Rikers has been around for so long and been proposed so many times. I think it's an interesting idea because the isolation of Rikers is what makes it so unique. But everybody kind of is like, yeah, Rikers, it's messed up. But then it's like, okay, well then you have to get on board with there being smaller jails all around the city. Right. Will people do that?
The question that the local stuff kind of raises is, you know, can you make this system fair and humane? Is that possible to do? You know, I mean, you've written about, I think you wrote about a prison guard, right? A correction officer who exposed wrongdoing and ultimately apparently killed himself,
yes.
right? And you've written about the fact that the Prison Rape Elimination Act is this thing that was passed and, you know, is, I don't know,
13 years ago it was
right?
passed.
And yet I have a feeling that act still occurs. And so part of it is like, do you think we delude ourselves into thinking that we can make prison a humane place? Or is it just that environment is bound to be horrible and we just have to keep as many people out of it as possible?
Well, the fact that it's so closed off and so insular is what makes it so difficult, I think, to really enact change. You have people who have been in the job decades. You have a place that, you know, no one's allowed to visit. Even as a reporter, it's like extremely difficult, and you know when you're there, you're just being shown what they are allowing you to see. So I think that's what makes it so uniquely difficult to other sort of reforms or ideas in policy that have to do with other parts of our communities. Like, that is a place where you can't see it unless you're in it, and once you're in it, you're no longer a reliable source of what's going on. So it's like circular.
So I guess two things. The first is that I think one reason New York cannot be a national model is because it doesn't rely on the funds that it doesn't rely on funds from the criminal justice system the way a lot of other cities do. So it's easy for
true.
New York to make these reforms because it doesn't need the money from these court costs, while many, like the majority of small cities across America, do.
Right.
So it maybe could be a model for like big cities, but
Yeah.
not necessarily nationally.
So one thing that I wrestle with is, you know, I've been interested in this stuff and written about it for, you know, a very long time. And so the fact that this is sort of the it topic is a double-edged sword, right? It's nice that everyone's interested in this, but it also means that people are coming into my space. And so how do you approach the beat these days? There's so much emotion and so much interest in this issue. What do you feel like it's our job to do?
It's funny, and I bet you guys have had this too, but where like something you wrote about in like 2012, now it's suddenly like a big issue.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, I already kind of wrote about this, so
I
I don't
know.
want to. Like I wrote a story on like
made that issue.
pretrial detention in like 2012 in San Francisco, and now like everyone's writing about it. I'm like, oh, well, I wrote about this like 3 years ago, but nobody cared. But,
Right.
We
cared.
I appreciate it. I think it's a good thing, though. I think it's a good thing.
I do
think,
too.
yeah, it's always a good thing when more people care about the things you're writing about, right? It's like it's a reason, like we have our jobs, is because people
and more
care
people
about this more.
will put it on the front page. That's good. Like, yeah, more attention is definitely better.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, is there? You know, you talked about, for example, the nonviolent drug offenders being inflated in
Yeah.
terms of their importance. So is that a danger that with popular attention, and no offense to them, but like CNN talking about this issue, that some of these sort of factual niceties will be sort of plowed over and, you know, that will inhibit real reform, or is all attention good attention?
I don't know. I feel like all we can do is be at least somewhat thankful that the issue is being discussed in a national place like CNN, and even though they might be a bit behind and they're focusing on things that are out there that maybe don't really need that much focus, I still think when you, at least at the very least, it gets your average person who maybe turns on CNN for 15 minutes a day, isn't like a news junkie like us reading everything available, to at least like think, even if they're only feeling compassion for a nonviolent drug offender, I'm glad they're feeling some thought about how long should people really be incarcerated. So I don't know, like I'm with all the attention as a reporter, it's interesting because you just have to work harder to find the unique story and the unique angle. It's not like when I first started doing this, I felt like, and it wasn't even that long ago, it was like 4 years ago, it was like no one was writing about it. And now everyone is, so the competition is much more fierce, but you just have to, there's so many stories out there. I mean, there's just so many. So as someone who, if you write about it a lot, you just avoid kind of the story everybody's doing and you look for the more unique one, it's actually frees you up in a lot of ways, because maybe you'd be writing about the thing that everyone was doing that day, and now you get freed up to do the story that no one saw because it took a lot more digging, or it took a lot more FOIA requests and time to uncover.
Well, that is a good point. There is like a certain freedom in not feeling obligated to have to kind of cover the obvious issue, because there's like many other people covering it, so you can just focus your attention on what is the next thing, what is kind of the more specific, unique, narrow story that hasn't been told.
Right.
Yeah.
Or you can make fun of that ever coverage. That's an option too. Well, on that note, good work, guys.
Yes, thanks so
Cheers.
much. Cheers.
Drink, try not to get arrested.
Justice.